June 26, 1944. The sun hung low over the airstrip at Hollandia, Dutch New Guinea. The humid air shimmered above rows of twin-engine fighters, Lockheed P-38 Lightnings, sleek and silver, glinting in the late afternoon haze. Inside a bamboo hut that served as the operations room, Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald, commander of the 475th Fighter Group, leaned over a checkers board, his focus locked on the next move. The hum of insects filled the air, mingling with the distant clatter of maintenance crews tending to the day's war machines. Then came a knock on the screen door. A tall, lean man stepped inside. His khaki shirt bore no rank insignia, no medals and no sidearm. Only the quiet confidence of someone who had faced the sky before. "Colonel MacDonald," he said politely, "I'm Charles Lindbergh." For a moment the room froze. Even among seasoned fighter pilots, that name carried weight. This was the Charles Lindbergh, the man who had crossed the Atlantic alone, who had become both a symbol of courage and a figure of controversy. He wasn't military anymore, but something about his presence still carried command. Lindbergh explained that he had come as a civilian technical advisor for United Aircraft, tasked with studying fighter operations in combat. His request was simple: to observe and, if possible, join missions to learn how the P-38s performed under fire. MacDonald hesitated. A civilian in combat? It sounded absurd. But Lindbergh wasn't just any civilian, and deep down, MacDonald sensed that this visit might lead to something extraordinary. In that steamy corner of the Pacific, no one could have guessed that this unassuming man would soon rewrite the rulebook on air combat efficiency. He wasn't there to fight for fame or glory. He was there for precision, for understanding how far an airplane could truly go when every drop of fuel, every ounce of thrust, was pushed to its limit. The knock on that door marked the beginning of one of the least known yet most influential chapters of World War II. The story of how one man's quiet genius would make America's P-38 Lightnings nearly untouchable. Long before Charles Lindbergh ever set foot on a wartime airstrip, the world already knew him as the man who defied the impossible. In May of 1927, he became the first person to cross the Atlantic Ocean alone, flying his silver monoplane, the Spirit of St. Louis, and from New York to Paris. That flight lasted over 33 hours, through storms, exhaustion, and uncharted skies. Yet it wasn't just a feat of endurance. It was a triumph of calculation. Lindbergh had done something few understood at the time. He'd studied every drop of fuel, every gust of wind, every angle of lift. He approached flight not just as a pilot, but as a scientist of the sky. Where others saw a limit, Lindbergh saw a variable to be mastered. He learned how to coax distance out of every gallon, how to balance power and efficiency in perfect harmony. That obsession with efficiency became his lifelong pursuit. Through the 1930s, he traveled the globe, mapping air routes across oceans, jungles, and deserts. He tested aircraft under extreme conditions, pushing engines to the edge of their performance envelopes. His notebooks were filled not with heroic tales, but with numbers, mixture ratios, and mechanical sketches, proof that behind his fame was a mind wired for precision. By the time the world plunged into war, Lindbergh was no longer just an aviation hero. He was a living archive of flight knowledge. He understood engines in ways even manufacturers didn't. He could hear a misfire before the instruments caught it, sense drag by the feel of the controls, and stretch range with a few subtle adjustments to the throttle and propeller pitch. To the pilots of World War II, he was a legend from another time. To engineers, he was a man decades ahead of his era. And to the P-38 squadrons fighting over the Pacific, he was about to become something else entirely. A quiet revolutionary who would teach them that the difference between life and death in the sky often came down to how wisely a man used his fuel. When World War II erupted, Charles Lindbergh was a man divided between reputation and conviction. His pre-war stance, a firm belief that America should stay out of Europe's conflict, had made him one of the most controversial figures in the country. To some, he was a patriot urging caution. To others, a symbol of dangerous isolationism. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, everything changed, except for one thing: his desire to serve. Lindbergh tried to return to the U.S. Army Air Forces, the organization he had once helped inspire through his early flights. But the political scars of his speeches ran deep. The Roosevelt administration refused him reinstatement. His name, though still famous, was burdened by misunderstanding and mistrust. Officially, Lindbergh was grounded, yet the man who had conquered the Atlantic didn't accept walls easily. Through his deep connections in the aviation industry, Lindbergh found another way. United Aircraft, builder of the legendary Vought F-4U Corsair, invited him to work as a civilian technical consultant. His mission: to study aircraft performance in combat, analyze mechanical weaknesses, and train pilots to maximize efficiency. For Lindbergh, this was more than a job. It was redemption. He saw in the Pacific Theater a laboratory of war, where his obsession with precision could make a difference. But beneath his calm exterior, he also carried guilt, a need to prove that his heart still beat for his country. By mid-1944, he had made his way across the ocean once again, this time to New Guinea, not as a decorated hero but as an unarmed civilian. There in the steaming jungles and makeshift airfields carved out of red earth, he watched fighter groups prepare for missions that often stretched their aircraft to the brink. He saw pilots return with tanks nearly dry, engines sputtering, men exhausted. And he knew instinctively that something could be done. He wasn't there to fly for fame or politics. He was there for numbers, for fuel flow, propeller pitch, manifold pressure. And in that data, Lindbergh saw opportunity, an idea that might change everything. By June of 1944, the Allied push across the Pacific was in full swing. Airfields carved into the jungles of New Guinea had become forward operating bases for America's fighter groups. And among them stood Hollandia, a rough but vital airstrip alive with the roar of twin-engine P-38 Lightnings. It was here that Charles Lindbergh arrived, a civilian stepping into a world of war. When he first set foot on the base, pilots stared. The sight was almost surreal. The quiet, world-famous aviator walking past fuel drums and grounded planes, clipboard in hand, wearing no insignia. Some men saluted instinctively. Others just watched, unsure whether to treat him as a legend or an intruder. Lindbergh began humbly. He didn't order or lecture. He listened. He walked the flight line, asking mechanics about their engines, talking to pilots about their missions, where fuel was spent, where power dropped off, how far they could push before turning back. The answers painted a troubling picture. The P-38 Lightning was fast and powerful, capable of climbing high and striking hard. But in the humid heat of the Pacific, it had one flaw: range. Most combat sorties returned with almost empty tanks, leaving little margin for error. A diversion for weather or an extended dogfight could mean running out of fuel over open sea. Many pilots had already paid the price. Lindbergh studied every detail: the takeoff procedures, the cruising settings, even how pilots adjusted propeller pitch. He noticed patterns no one else saw. Pilots ran their engines at high RPMs, consuming more fuel than necessary, following factory manuals that assumed short missions over Europe, not long-range operations over endless ocean. One man took notice of Lindbergh's curiosity: Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald, commander of the 475th Fighter Group, known as Satan's Angels. A decorated ace and respected leader, MacDonald was cautious but open-minded. When Lindbergh requested permission to fly on combat missions as an observer, MacDonald hesitated. It wasn't every day a civilian asked to join a dogfight, but something in Lindbergh's calm confidence convinced him. He approved the request. No one yet realized that this quiet decision to let a civilian climb into a combat aircraft would mark the beginning of a transformation that would change the way America's P-38s fought, flew, and survived. The first time Charles Lindbergh climbed into the cockpit of a P-38 Lightning in a combat zone, it wasn't as a guest, it was as one of them. He strapped into the narrow seat, the twin Allison engines rumbling to life beneath him, their deep metallic growl echoing through the steaming jungle air. The sun rose behind the mountains, glinting off the polished aluminum wings as a formation of fighters taxied toward the runway. On June 27, 1944, Lindbergh joined a mission led by Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald himself, a strike against Japanese barges and installations near Kaibos Bay. The objective was routine. The presence of the world's most famous aviator was anything but. From takeoff to target, Lindbergh flew with quiet precision. His movements were smooth, deliberate, nothing wasted. While others throttled up to full cruise, Lindbergh adjusted his propeller pitch, lowered RPMs, leaned the fuel mixture, and kept his manifold pressure steady. It was a delicate balancing act, a harmony between engine and air. When the flight returned to Hollandia after more than 5 hours in the sky, mechanics gathered to refuel the planes. That's when the pilots noticed something peculiar. Lindbergh's P-38 still held nearly 40% of its fuel load, double what most others had left. At first, the men laughed it off. Maybe he'd throttled back, flown slower, avoided combat. But the following missions proved otherwise. On July 1st and again on July 3rd, Lindbergh joined longer sorties and strafing, escorting, even engaging in light dogfights. And every time, his Lightning came home with far more fuel than anyone else's. It wasn't luck. It was mastery. Lindbergh had unlocked a secret buried in the P-38's design, an efficiency that no one had dared to explore. His engine settings defied the manuals. His approach went against every rule pilots had been taught. Yet his results were undeniable. McDonnell began to take notice. The men started whispering about the Lindbergh way, curious but skeptical. How could a civilian, even the Charles Lindbergh, outfly seasoned combat pilots in their own machines? What they didn't know was that Lindbergh wasn't trying to outfly them. He was trying to teach them how to outlast the war itself. Within days, curiosity spread across the base. Pilots who once smirked at the idea of a civilian in their midst began asking questions. How was Lindbergh saving so much fuel without losing speed? How was he pushing his P-38 farther than the manuals claimed possible? Lindbergh didn't keep it secret. One humid evening, he gathered a handful of pilots in the mess hall. A crude bamboo shack lit by oil lamps, its walls echoing with the buzz of insects and distant engines. Maps and flight logs were scattered across the table as Lindbergh began to speak in his calm, analytical voice. He explained that the key was not power, but balance. Pilots had been trained to cruise their P-38s at high revolutions per minute, around 200 to 400 RPM, believing that lower settings would harm the engines. But Lindbergh had discovered something different. By running the engines at a lower RPM, around 1600, and compensating with slightly higher manifold pressure, the aircraft could maintain speed while drastically reducing fuel consumption. He demonstrated the principle of over-square operation, high manifold pressure with low RPM, a concept most military pilots feared. But Lindbergh's real-world flights proved that the Allison engines could handle it safely, provided the mixture was leaned correctly and temperatures were watched carefully. The pilots listened in disbelief. For years, engineers and instructors had warned against running engines that way. It was dangerous, they said. "It'll wreck your pistons," they claimed. But Lindbergh, who had spent his life pushing machines to their limits, knew that rules written in comfort rarely survived in war. He ended with a simple line that silenced the room. "Gentlemen, if you can stretch your range by 400 miles, so that could be the difference between coming home or not." The next morning, McDonnell authorized test flights using Lindbergh's methods. One by one, the pilots took to the sky, their skepticism fading as they landed with tanks far fuller than before. For the first time, the impossible seemed practical. The P-38's wings hadn't changed. Its engines hadn't changed. What changed was how men understood them. And that shift, born in a dimly lit hut on a remote Pacific island, would soon ripple across the entire U.S. air fleet. Innovation in wartime rarely comes without resistance. As word of Lindbergh's methods spread, so did rumors and criticism. Some senior officers dismissed the idea outright. "A stunt flyer thinks he knows better than our engineers." One colonel reportedly scoffed. Others worried that if the practice damaged engines, they'd lose valuable aircraft in the middle of combat. But the frontline pilots were not so quick to ignore results. Every test flight confirmed Lindbergh's claims. The gauges told the truth. Lower RPMs, higher manifold pressure, leaner mixtures, and longer range. Missions that used to consume 250 gallons now burned barely 180. It was as if the aircraft had gained a hidden reserve of endurance. Still, there was tension. The Air Force manuals explicitly warned against over-square operation. Some pilots felt torn between doctrine and survival. But Lindbergh wasn't preaching defiance. He was demonstrating knowledge. He flew every mission himself, side by side with the men, putting his own life on the line to prove the method worked. One particularly grueling mission tested everything. The target lay deep beyond normal range, Japanese shipping near Borneo. The flight lasted over 6 hours. When the squadron returned, most planes were dangerously low on fuel. Lindbergh's P-38, however, landed with nearly a quarter tank remaining. That night, even the skeptics fell silent. The data spoke louder than opinion. MacDonald, once cautious, became an advocate. If Lindbergh says it works, he told his men. From then on, the 475th Fighter Group began adopting the technique fully. Pilots who once laughed at the Lindbergh way now practiced it with religious precision, watching their RPMs, trimming their engines, conserving every drop. The results transformed operations. Missions that were once marginal became routine. Squadrons could now escort bombers to distant islands, strike deeper into enemy territory, and return with enough fuel to fight again. In a matter of weeks, Charles Lindbergh, the civilian who wasn't supposed to be there, had changed the way an entire theater of war flew its aircraft. Though Lindbergh had come as a technical advisor, his time in the cockpit soon pulled him into combat. Flying over the steaming jungles and endless blue of the Pacific, he faced the same dangers as any other pilot. Flak bursts rocked the air. Japanese fighters clawed at formations from the clouds. On July 28, 1944, during a bomber escort mission near the island of Palau, Lindbergh's quiet professionalism was put to the ultimate test. Midway through the mission, a Japanese Ki-51 Sonya dive bomber appeared below the formation, banking for an attack run. Without hesitation, Lindbergh peeled away from his element, dropping into a pursuit dive. He eased the throttle forward, not recklessly, but with control born from experience. The P-38's twin engines howled as he lined up his shot. The moment came quickly, a flicker of tracers, a burst of smoke, and the Ki-51 spiraled down in flames. The kill wasn't officially recorded. Lindbergh was a civilian, and civilians couldn't earn combat credit, but every man in the formation saw it happen. From that day on, there were no more doubts. Lindbergh wasn't just an observer. He was one of them. He continued flying missions almost daily, low-level strafing runs, bomber escorts, long-range patrols. His calm demeanor under fire inspired confidence. Pilots who once doubted him now watched his settings, copied his engine management, and trusted his instincts. In his personal notes, Lindbergh wrote not of glory but of mechanics, cylinder head temperatures, throttle responses, propeller drag. Even in combat, his mind dissected the machine. He wasn't chasing kills, he was chasing perfection. By the end of the summer, his reputation in the Pacific had changed entirely. The man once branded a political outcast was now a quiet hero among the fighter groups. And though no medal would bear his name, every pilot who made it home on fumes owed part of that survival to the lessons Lindbergh had taught them. As reports filtered up the chain of command, the Air Force could no longer ignore what was happening in New Guinea. Pilots from multiple groups, not just the 475th, were returning from missions with unprecedented range and fuel efficiency. The common thread in every report, Lindbergh's method. By late 1944, senior officers and technical advisors began studying his engine settings in detail. Mechanics verified that no engine damage had occurred. Engineers reviewed his data and, to their surprise, confirmed its validity. Lindbergh's adjustments were not reckless improvisations. They were sound aeronautical engineering, simply overlooked amid wartime caution. Soon, training materials and operational guidelines were updated. New pilots were briefed on cruise efficiency procedures, a formalized version of Lindbergh's technique. What had begun as a civilian's experiment became standard military practice. The strategic impact was enormous. The P-38 Lightning, once limited by its fuel capacity, became a true long-range weapon. Fighters could now accompany bombers to distant targets, raid Japanese bases previously out of reach, and return safely. The expanded range also allowed Allied forces to strike from safer, rearward airfields, reducing casualties and speeding the Pacific advance. For the pilots, it wasn't just about fuel. It was about survival. Knowing they had extra range meant they could fight longer, detour around storms, or assist downed comrades without fearing they'd never make it home. When word finally reached the top, even the most skeptical commanders acknowledged Lindbergh's contribution. Though he would never wear the uniform again, his name was quietly etched into operational history. The official records might call it range extension techniques, but the men who flew them knew the truth. It was Lindbergh's way. When Charles Lindbergh left the Pacific later that year, he did so without fanfare. There was no parade, no formal commendation, just a quiet departure from a small island airfield, leaving behind a legacy that would outlast him. His contribution wasn't forged in the crucible of command, but in the discipline of understanding. He'd reminded the world that innovation is born not from authority, but from curiosity, from the willingness to challenge what everyone else accepts as unchangeable. Lindbergh's methods would continue to influence aviation long after the war. Pilots carried his lessons into Korea, into Vietnam, and into the jet age itself. His principles on balance, efficiency, respect for the machine became timeless truths of flight. For the men of the 475th Fighter Group, his memory lingered in every takeoff. They remembered the quiet civilian who flew into battle beside them, unarmed, unafraid, focused entirely on the small, precise details that kept engines alive. In the grand story of World War II, his chapter was brief but powerful. He didn't change the war with bombs or bullets. He changed it with understanding. And in that, Charles Lindbergh proved something extraordinary. That even in the fiercest storms of conflict, one man's mastery of peace, of patience, calculation, and faith in human ingenuity can still alter the course of history.